Hello and welcome, I am Thomas Porteus. Today we'll be diving into an insightful discussion on the influence of Israel and Gaza, the situation in the Middle East. Israel accused Hezbollah of violating the terms of their 60-day ceasefire set to expire on January the 26th, threatening action if violations continue. This follows reports of over 800 Israeli airstrikes and ground attacks after the ceasefire began. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz stated Hezbollah has not moved its militants or weapons north of the Litani River, as agreed. Hezbollah's Naim Qassem warned of returning to attacks if Israeli troops don't fully withdraw. Israeli forces have killed at least 88. The anchor intro is Hello and welcome, I am Thomas Porteus. Today we'll be diving into an insightful discussion on Hello and welcome, I am Thomas Porteus, and today we'll be diving into an insightful discussion about the situation in the Middle East. Israel accused Hezbollah of violating terms of their 60-day ceasefire set to expire on January the 26th, threatening action if violations continue. This follows reports of over 800 Israeli air and ground attacks after the ceasefire began. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz stated Hezbollah has not moved its militants or weapons north of the Litani River, as agreed. Hezbollah's Naim Qassem warned of returning to attacks if Israeli troops don't fully withdraw. Israeli forces have killed at least 88 Palestinians in a single day across Gaza, conducting over 100 airstrikes in 3 days. And more than 200 Palestinians have been killed, with women and children accounting for the majority of victims. On the other hand, Hamas has released a video of a 19-year-old Israeli captive, Liri Albag, urging her government to reach a deal for her release. Albag, who was taken hostage during Hamas's October the 7th attack on Israel, appears in the footage calling on Israel to act. 5 other women soldiers captured with her remain in captivity. Let's take a look at the video.
קוראים לי לירי אלבג, אני בת 19, כבר מעל 450 יום שאני בשבי בעזה. אני רק בת 19, כל החיים שלי לפניי, כל החיים שלי נעצרו. היום התחילה שנה חדשה, כל העולם חוגג את הסילבסטר, ורק אנחנו מתחילים פה שנה חשוכה, שנה של בדידות. אנחנו לא בסדר העדיפויות של הממשלה שלנו, של הצבא שלנו. כבר העולם התחיל לשכוח אותנו. כבר לעולם לא אכפת מאיתנו. אמא, אבא, רוני, שי, גיא, ניר, שאר המשפחה והחברים, אני אוהבת אתכם כל כך ומתגעגעת עד אינסוף. היינו ונותרנו עם אחת פצוע קשה, וכל זה בגלל המרדף המטורף של הצבא. אנחנו בסיוט מזעזע. אנחנו יודעים שהחיים שלנו תלויים בזה, אם הצבא יגיע לאזור שלנו או לא. אני שואלת אתכם, ממשלת ישראל, אם היה פה מישהו מהיקירים שלכם, מהאהובים שלכם, מלחמה הייתה נמשכת עד עכשיו? אני באמת שואלת אתכם, הייתם הורגים אותנו? שר הביטחון, אתה מכיר את אבא שלי. תסתכל לו בעיניים ותגיד לו שלא מגיע לו ולאמא שלי. לחבק את הבת שלהם. תסתכל עליהם ותגיד להם את זה. כי אין לך אומץ. אני יודעת שאין לך אומץ. אחרי שראיתי את המוות שלי בעיניים. ומה שקרה עם החבר שלי. הבנתי שהחיים שלי לא מספיק חשובים. הבנתי שאנחנו משחק בשבילכם. הבנתי שזה פשוט אתם משחקים לנו בגורל.
Thank you for joining us. The first part of this discussion will be Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire, and we will then move on to the Gaza crisis. Joining us today is Irina Tuskerman, Editor-in-Chief of the Washington Outsider, Miri Ezine, Colonel Lev Aran, former coordinator of Israel-India Parliamentary Friendship League, Suresh Goel, former diplomat. Thank you all for joining us. My first question is to Irina Tuskerman. What is your assessment of the current fragile ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hezbollah, and how sustainable do you believe it is?
From the beginning of the ceasefire, I thought it was a very, very fragile agreement. I think both sides essentially needed to regroup. There was a pressure for Israel to fight on multiple fronts, and after dealing very heavy blows to Hezbollah, Israel needed to shift its focus to try to rescue the hostages, to deal with Iran directly, and to replenish its supplies, to give its troops a rest. However, the agreement itself changed nothing about the nature of the conflict, the reasons for the conflict, or the fact that, or anything about Hezbollah as a terrorist organization answerable directly to Iran. It was only a question of time before Hezbollah started to push the envelope to test Israel and to try to put pressure on the northern front. Until recently, the main point of pressure were the Houthi attacks. Once Israel started responding much more aggressively to the attacks coming from Yemen, Hezbollah's role was to put enough pressure that could deter Israel from focusing exclusively on Houthis and on possibly taking out the Houthi leadership, as Israel has threatened to do. In other words, all of these proxies are assisting one another, distracting from focusing on any one front in particular, and complementing the overall strategy of keeping this war of attrition going indefinitely and keeping up the economic difficulties, the spending that Israel of the resources that Israel has to allocate, contributing to internal tensions inside Israel because the war is difficult. It's difficult psychologically on the population. It's difficult on the families of the soldiers fighting there, and to basically perpetuate the state of continuous conflict with no break.
I want to move now on to Miri Ezine, retired IDF colonel. How do you view the Israel's strikes on Hezbollah bases and weapons factories?
It's funny how none of us ever ask how the country called Lebanon has this, it's not a growth. It is the largest terror army in the world. It has so much weapons that we in Israel, and I say myself, as an expert who was looking both at Hezbollah, at Syria, at Hamas, we were surprised by the amount of weapons that we went to expose. What we're talking about right now is an enormous cache of weapons supplied, as Irina said before, from the Islamic regime of Iran via that dictator who does not exist anymore, Bashar al-Assad, via Syria, via that way into Lebanon. And what Israel is doing right now is continuing what it has done over the last year and 3 months. Hezbollah started to fire at Israel on October 8th, 2023. I am in 2025. They joined in, they fired at Israel. They had forces that were ready to attack themselves, the Radwan forces. And when we're talking about Hezbollah inside Lebanon, it's a Lebanese force, it's an Arabic-speaking force, but it is not the Lebanese army. It is a terror military army inside Lebanon. For Israel right now, we still have not been able to allow our own citizens to go back to where they live in Israel, inside Israel, not anywhere else, to go back into their communities, not because it's dangerous because of Hezbollah, but because Hezbollah systematically, over the last 14 months, destroyed one after another, dozens of different communities, targeting the houses, targeting the buildings, targeting the schools. All of this is something where now we need to go back and rebuild. Israel right now is both in a tension against Hezbollah trying to find itself, to understand what it is after what Israel did to it over the last 6 months. I disagree a bit here with Irina. I think that Hezbollah was heavily degraded. I think that the Islamic regime of Iran lost its most important commando terror force. I think that what happened in Syria in December is a direct result of Hezbollah having been in close as the leader commando group, the one that was leading Shiite forces both in Syria, in the Syrian military under Bashar al-Assad. There were Hezbollah forces and commanders in Yemen with the Houthis, and in the months that Israel was attacking the Hezbollah terror army in Lebanon, those different commanders came back to Lebanon, and we have seen that difference in the capabilities, in the complete destruction of Bashar al-Assad, backed by the Shiites, backed by Iran, backed by Hezbollah. That collapse, which is a good thing for the Syrian people. But hand in hand with that, we have seen that the Houthis now fire on their own. Israel never focused on the Houthis. We focused on Hezbollah, we have a border with Lebanon. We focused on Bashar al-Assad and the Shiites and the Iranians in Syria, we have a border with Syria. The Houthis in Yemen are 2,000 kilometers away. It's further away than Iran. Right now, Israel is upping its focus, both at the Houthis in Yemen and continuing to look at the challenge of what Hezbollah itself, backed by the Islamic regime of Iran, wants to do in Lebanon. And I think that we're hearing different voices from the Prime Minister of Lebanon, different voices who are willing to say we need a president in Lebanon, not looking at Hezbollah as a building force in Lebanon, but rather viewing it as a very destructive force. And Israeli attacks in that sense against the different capabilities, terror military capabilities of Hezbollah, I don't think that they will stop as long as there's nobody else who is going to make Hezbollah accountable.
Lev Aran, I wanted to move to you next. What is Israel prepared to do if Hezbollah does not fully withdraw its troops beyond the Litani River, beyond the 60-day deadline?
I think the proxy paradigm of Iran has failed. And in a way, I don't think that most of Lebanese see Hezbollah in the same way they saw it 2 years back. So we have a weaker Hezbollah. Israel is not afraid of Hezbollah the way we were even half a year ago, simply because we were afraid that the war with Hezbollah will be much costlier, that the death toll will be much heavier. And at the end of the game, we saw that Israel is much stronger. We also saw that Hezbollah does not know which officers they can trust and which ones are actually our chamchas, our agents inside Hezbollah. So in a way, Israel will not leave Lebanon before Hezbollah will move to the Litani River, north of the Litani River, and I don't think that Israel will pay a diplomatic price for insisting that all Hezbollah terrorists are on the northern part of the Litani River. Situation has changed after the walkie-talkie and the pager attack. It has changed after the Hamas defeat in Gaza, and as Miri said correctly, the fact that the only rival that we see right now is 2,000 kilometers from us does not work for Hezbollah.
Miri, I want to come back to you. Does Israel see any potential benefits in integrating the UNIFIL or the Lebanese army more closely into the enforcement of the ceasefire, or to avoid unilateral actions? Okay. Suresh Goyal, I want to ask you, given the humanitarian impact on displaced families from both sides, what steps should be prioritized to facilitate the return of displaced communities?
Thank you very much, Thomas. I mean, it's a good question that you have asked me, but I think I want to go beyond this. I want to go beyond the humanitarian aspect of it, because we have seen clearly that in the Middle East, any kind of a humanitarian solution would depend on the political will of both Israel and the countries in the Middle East. Two or three things here, and I'm saying that on the basis that I have dealt with this issue for more than 30 years of my life, my diplomatic life. Number one, is Israel prepared to accept an independent state for Palestine? They are not. It has been made sufficiently clear that the two-state solution, which even Carter had advocated, which Clinton advocated, on which there were so many discussions, both in the USA, the supporter of Israel, it didn't work out. And therefore, the only solution that will be acceptable to Israel, the most dominant military power in the region, incidentally, and supported by USA militarily and financially, as far as that can be, that there will be no solution with accommodation for Palestine. That is point number one. Hamas made a mistake on 7th October 2023 when they went into that party being done by the Israeli youth. That was a huge mistake. I don't know why they did it, because basically they should have known that it would invite severe retaliation from Israeli IDF, and therefore they should have done it, because nothing would have been able to solve the situation. It was a huge mistake, and I condemn them for it. But it happened. After that, what has happened is basically a decimation of Palestinian people in Gaza. The situation, as we see day in and day out in Gaza, is clearly not just eliminating Hamas, but it's basically making sure that people in Gaza are not able to make a Palestinian state, which actually they wanted. The two parts of the Palestinian state were Gaza and the Western Bank. In both the areas, IDF has made pretty clear that Palestinians are not acceptable. And therefore, the only political solution that is acceptable to Israel is without Palestine. The organization like Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, no doubt, I have no doubt whatsoever that they've been indulging in activities of terrorism. But the fact is, when were they created? When did they come out? I'm not supporter of the thesis that terrorism requires a cause. But in this particular case, they all came basically after the Palestinian cause was defeated. And therefore, what I would say is, eventually, in this particular case, it doesn't matter what happens in Lebanon. Golan Heights, Israel has already declared to occupy Golan Heights, and they want to create another settlement in Golan Heights. They will do it. Hezbollah will be
Thank you.
No problem at all.
Thank you. Apologies for the interruption, but I want to move to our next part of the debate, which is obviously the ongoing Gaza crisis. Hamas released a video of one of the hostages, and Israel have killed 88 people in Gaza today alone. Irina, I wanted to come to you and ask, what's your perspective on the humanitarian toll of the conflict on both sides?
The humanitarian toll has been, without a question, disastrous, and it's been as difficult for Israel in many respects Yes, Israel has always had a stronger economy. Obviously, it's a state actor with a government that is responsible for its people, but the toll has been difficult on the economy, on the displacement of Israelis from the north, on the families broken up by the war and by the conflict, of course, on the communities affected by the hostage crisis. And in Gaza, the situation has been disastrous precisely because Hamas wanted it to be as disastrous as possible. Disastrous humanitarian situation in Gaza is good for Hamas and for the perpetuation this rhetoric of resistance, of continuing never-ending resistance to Israel for recruitment of fighters, even when there is when there's a blockade, no access to weapons, a continuing state of hostilities, and it is that therefore it's in Hamas's interest to block humanitarian aid, even that approved by Israel for entry. And there's been massive influx of humanitarian aid. It's not true that there is a shortage. Hamas has been selling it off on the markets to make money to continue the conflict. It has been raising the prices of humanitarian aid. So while it is not true that there is some sort of an Israel-inflicted famine, the prices have risen, the situation has become much more difficult, and Hamas has refused to take responsibility for it. Its actual statement on the record has been that it's the United Nations' responsibility to take care of the civilians, and that Hamas is there for the fighting, essentially. And they have never been held accountable for this language, for the fact that they have been deliberately stealing aid, sending armed gangs to steal aid, creating dangerous circumstances, and putting the onus on IDF to risk their lives to try to get that aid to the civilians, which is not the IDF's responsibility, by the way. Their only responsibility is to ensure that the humanitarian aid gets in unimpeded on their side. So we see a situation where a non-state actor that is trying to play both sides, trying to get legitimacy as a governing entity and actually not carry out any of its duties as government. And we have seen very little pressure from the international community on Hamas to be held accountable for creating this completely self-inflicted crisis in Gaza, for not releasing the hostages. And the longer the crisis goes on, the more Hamas gains legitimacy from continuing to use hostages as a pawn, instead of unequivocally condemning this action. It has been equivocated to the demands made by the international community on Israel, which itself contributes to this crisis, because Hamas feels that they're being treated as an equal partner, and therefore can continue to use hostages and completely illegitimate means to push for their demands. And that's what's causing and contributing to the crisis, to the never-ending state of war. If Hamas were actually treated the way Al-Qaeda and ISIS were treated by the international community, as a threat to international order, with whom there can be no negotiations of any kind, maybe the situation would have been resolved much faster, prevented many unnecessary civilian deaths, and Gaza wasn't completely destroyed.
Levaran, I wanted to come to you next. Given reports from the UN and places like Human Rights Watch, what steps is Israel taking to minimize the harm of Gaza's civilians? Now, there have been reports of them cutting water supplies off. How is this humanitarian aid getting to those in need in Gaza?
I don't think we need to place anybody, Israeli, Arabs, on a pedestal beyond debate. Okay, I guess that Israel is doing mistakes, and also some Arab partners are doing mistakes, but we need to remember that Hamas started the war, and we need to remember that Hamas can release the hostages and end the war. So the question is not historically who is right and who is wrong. And I believe that the former ambassador knows that most of the books that were written about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they said that the one party that was ready for an independent Palestinian state was Israel, not the Palestinians themselves. So since Hamas started the war and since they have the hostages, I don't think there is a way to end the when the hostages are still there. And we heard the voice of Liria Elbag. On one hand, we are so relieved that she's alive. We didn't know she's alive or she was murdered by Hamas. So at least we know that she's alive. On the other hand, and as long as she and around other 100 hostages are still within the Hamas captivity, I don't see how the war can end. What one could imagine that Israel will say, okay, we end the war and now Hamas will decide whatever it wants with the hostages. It doesn't make any logic. So we should not treat Hamas as a normal entity. Hamas, as Al-Qaeda, as ISIS, is a terror organization that should be destroyed. And if they do not want to be destroyed, or if they want to go to exile, to Qatar, to Algeria, some options were there, they need to give back the hostages. Otherwise, the war will continue, and the war has a death toll, a death toll that we all feel sorry for. I don't think that anybody is happy to hear that 70 or 80 or 90 people were killed among the Palestinians. But to end the war, there is one party that can end the war, and this is Hamas.
Ambassador Suresh Goel, so I would like to go back to you, Lev Aran. How does Israel respond to allegations of genocide in Gaza? You say that you don't like those statements.
I think what most Israelis will tell you that Gaza had half-lakh people in 48 and had 23, 24 lakhs at the beginning of the war. That no Israeli government wants to change the demography of Gaza. And of course, we have right-wing ministers who are toying with the idea of putting Jewish settlements and so on. But even within this right-wing government, they are in a minority. I don't think the official policy of the current Netanyahu government is to put Israeli settlements in Gaza or to toy with the idea that Arab Gazans will not be in Gaza. I think the only idea is to have a peaceful Gaza next to Israel. So if, again, if we measure a genocide by the intention to lower the population of the other side, I don't think that any government, this government or the last government, are even toying with this idea. And I don't think that most Israelis agree with the idea of genocide.
Well, thank you so much for everyone who joined us today on this debate, and thank you to our guests as well. We will continue to bring you more news updates on the conflict in the Middle East and as it intensifies. Thank you very much.